Very lucky. I'm going to let Ali ask his Shadi question, and then Shadi, you've got two, but feel free a la carte to address any of the things, and Ismail as well, the questions addressed to Michelle. Ali, what's your question?
I'm Ali Ramadan Abu Zakuk from Libya, an elected member of parliament there in Libya. The question for Shadi, which is, by the way, a very beautiful presentation. You brought to us the dilemma between the nation state and the Islamic movement. In some of the writings of the Islamists, they are talking about the Islamization of the society, not the state. Where do you put the Muslim Brotherhood discourse in that sense? The other one is for Mr. Iskandarani. Mr. Sisi couldn't do anything for the ISIL fighters in Sinai. He sent his airplanes to hit Derna, where nothing came from Derna against him. Even the people who killed the Copts, they were in Sirt. So how do you explain this man? I mean, violating the sovereignty of the country and hitting a place where there was nothing that came from it against Egypt. Thank you.
Shadi.
Okay, so I'll address the previous two, then I'll address Ali's question. So first of all, the question on what did Morsi do that was Islamic in his year in power. So I think you're right to point out that there wasn't actually much in the way of passing Islamic laws. There was actually only one explicitly Islamic law, the Sukuk law, so Islamic bonds. So that's certainly true. But first of all, secularists dislike or hate Islamists not really because of what they do, but because of who they are. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter a whole lot what Islamists do or don't do. The fears are still going to be there. Now, that's problematic, but I think it's also fair to say that Islamists are Islamists for a reason. If they became liberals, that would defeat the purpose. They're Islamists because they believe in a distinctive social project. They do want to change state and society to some degree. Maybe not right away, but in the long run. So this was the problem whenever I would have conversations with secularists in Egypt. They're not so much, they weren't as much against what Morsi had done as much as what he might do in the future. And it's hard to have a conversation like that because you're debating something that hasn't actually happened yet, which is challenging. But I would say one thing on the Constitution, because I think that was a source of considerable fear, that there were problematic clauses that I think secular types worried would pave the way towards greater Islamization in the future. In particular, Articles 4 and 219. Now, if I was an Egyptian liberal living in Egypt, I would be quite, I'd be quite concerned. But the bigger thing here is a sense that Islamists, because they do much better in elections, and because liberals generally don't do well in elections, that over time, the Brotherhood would consolidate its hold on power. So, and I think, to be honest, developments in Turkey somewhat lend credence to those concerns, that over time, the AK Party has moved in a more explicitly Islamist direction on any number of issues. Now, the second, the question on Tunisia, just very, very briefly. So part of it is that Tunisia had a disproportionate contribution of foreign fighters even before the Arab Spring. So if you look at Iraq, on a per capita basis, Tunisia has had a problem for quite some time. It's gotten worse though, and I think it's a valid question to ask why. One is that democratization in the short run isn't necessarily stabilizing, and there's actually an entire academic literature about how short-term democratization can actually contribute to extremism, terrorism, destabilization. Of course, the reason that we believe in democracy is that in the long run or in the medium term, democracies do tend to stabilize, they do tend to perform better economically, but there is going to be an early phase of problems Because what democracy, what the advent of democracy does, first of all, is that it raises expectations wildly. So you have a whole citizenry that expects so much from the state, but there's a gap between what they expect and what they actually get. That leads to a lot of frustration. I would also say that there were hopes early on from Ennahda that they would be able to bring Salafis into the political process. That failed miserably, and Salafis by and large have stayed outside of the political process. Salafis are much stronger in Egypt, and if you had something like the Noor Party that won 28% of the popular vote in Egypt in 2011, if you had a well-established Salafi network that was able to bring people into the political process, that may have helped somewhat. But Salafis, by and large, have felt very alienated from the political process, and they've been very anti-system, very revolutionary, and some of them obviously have gone to fight abroad. And they also, I think, don't see, I met with some of the friends and families of foreign fighters who fought and died in Syria in my most recent trip. And one thing that I kept on hearing from people who are on the margins of society, I would say, well, Tunisia, is democratic. It has even an Islamist party that does pretty well and was in government. Shouldn't that be an outlet for grievance? But they didn't really agree with that characterization. And for those who are inclined towards Salafism, Ennahda isn't a viable option for them, in part because Ennahda has very aggressively moved to the center, and we can argue whether or not that's a smart electoral strategy. But if you want your politics very Islamic and very Islamist, Ennahda, at least for now, is not your best option. Lastly, on Ali, your question, so the question, of course, Islamists want to Islamize society, and I would argue that over the last 80 years, they've done a pretty good job of that in Egypt without being in government. You don't need to be in government to Islamize society. However, there is a reason that they wanted to run for the presidency and win the presidency. There's a reason that in Tunisia and Egypt, you see a shift away from dawah activities, especially in Tunisia. And that's also part of the problem, leaving the mosques and leaving local society to Salafis and other Islamists because you're so focused on parliamentary politics. And I remember in 2011, 2013, the Brotherhood in Egypt was obsessed with elections. That's all they ever talked about, that's all they ever cared about, and they believed that whenever there was instability, or whenever they had a problem with liberals, or whenever they had a problem with the military, their answer to any question was, once we have the next elections and win, it'll become more stable. That was what they were saying 2 months before the coup. We just have to fight. It's very bad now, it's difficult, but once we get to the next elections, and once we win, then things will stabilize. But I think that there's a real problem with being obsessed with the state. And I think you see this more and more in Turkey, to bring up that example again, that Erdogan, despite what he said in the mid-2000s, his very moderate rhetoric, now you see a very aggressive effort to use a very powerful Turkish state to essentially incentivize citizens to be more pious. So you give financial stipends to young people who get married early. You give them stipends if they have 3 or more kids. You expand tremendously the number of Imam Khatib schools. You Islamize the educational curricula by introducing Sirah and Quranic classes. They're elective classes, but these are still efforts to shift the basic tenor of society. And that's not surprising, because the state is so strong, unfortunately, in many cases, in the Arab world. So if you're looking for how to change society, the state becomes a very effective vehicle for changing society.
We've got about 2 more minutes for Ismail. If you need more time, let me know. But there was one question directed at you, and any of the other questions, if you have a quick comment.
Oh, yes, sorry. Here you go.
So I think we may collect more questions to answer it.
We don't have a lot of time left, so why don't you
it's
address
okay.
what's already been
Okay.
asked? And then,
Regarding the question on the Sisi's strike on Libya, I think you are right. There is a connection between what happened in Libya and what is happening in the Sinai. I'm not, I don't think that El-Sisi is interested in achievement as much as he is interested in the regional arrangements. So he doesn't look on the micro level or even the efficiency of these operations. It's planned and implemented in a regional context with some targets which is separated from the achievement of the accomplishment of its operational goals or targets. In Sinai, for example, I do think that it's a deal between El-Sisi and Israel to have a good partnership in fighting the common threat to secure the Israeli lobby here in DC or in Brussels before the elections to avoid considering it as a military coup, which means or which used to mean stopping the military aid, and this was quoted by the Hearts by some senior officers in Israel, and this was the same argument or the same statement of the Pentagon spokesman when he announced a release of 10 Apache helicopters from the frozen military aid, which is rephrasing or using the same phrase used by the senior officers in Haaretz story or report, arguing that it's a common security interest between Egypt, Israel, and USA. So it's a planned and applied or implemented in this kind of foreign affairs or international relations, disregarding what people are suffering from, or the achievement, the desired achievement, or what is claimed in the military propaganda, which is completely different from what is on the ground. Yes.
I'd like to invite the remaining questioner and any other questions to ask during the coffee break. We started about 20 minutes late. We've gone about 20 minutes over. We'd like to take a 15-minute coffee break now. There's coffee, tea, and delicious food outside. They'll direct you. I'd also like to thank Shadi Hamid and Ismail, is it Alexandrani or Iskandrani? I've heard it both ways. There are 1.5 Egyptians over here for an amazing...